George Floyd is finally laid to rest. His death sparked an unprecedented wave of anger against racism, both in the U.S. and globally. So, as the world mourns Floyd, what will it take to end racism? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. African-American George Floyd has been buried in his hometown. He's going to change the world, according to his brother. It's hoped his story will become a turning point in the fight against racism. And that's not just in the U.S. Rallies over racial oppression and police brutality are spanning continents. From the UK to Senegal, tens of thousands of people are kneeling or chanting, "I can't breathe." The gestures represent the moments a white police officer knelt on Floyd's neck. John Hendren reports from the city of Houston, where Floyd's funeral took place on Tuesday.
George Floyd's tragic journey ends at a Houston cemetery, but across the U.S., the movement he inspired continues. A montage of demonstrations in Floyd's name, played at his funeral, displays his legacy and inspires a call to action from civil rights leaders.
God took the rejected stone and made him the cornerstone of a movement that's going to change the whole wide world.
Friends and family remember the man they knew as Perry, or Big Floyd.
I'm going to miss my brother a whole lot, and I just want to say to him, I love you, and I thank God for giving me my own personal Superman.
This is not just murder, but a hate crime. I share happy memories with my uncle. Now that's all I have, are memories. I still can't put myself together to how he was calling my grandma a name. I believe my grandmother was right there with open arms saying, "Come home, baby, you shouldn't feel this pain. No one should feel this pain."
The life of the man who died beneath a policeman's knee was celebrated by members of Congress and a presidential candidate who spoke directly to Floyd's daughter, Gianna.
Now is the time for racial justice. That's the answer we must give to our children when they ask why. Because when there is justice for George Floyd, we will truly be on our way to racial justice in America. And then, as you said, Gianna, your daddy will have changed the world.
The funeral followed memorials in Minneapolis and North Carolina and a viewing in Houston attended by thousands who remembered his final words, "I can't breathe." In the weeks, months, and years after these people have left this ceremony, George Floyd may well be best remembered as an accidental agent of change, someone who transformed the world less by what he did than by what was done to him. Some who didn't make the invitation list inside said they were outside because they're concerned about the next generation.
I came out because I'm a black mom with 2 black sons, a daughter, and I have grandsons that's afraid of the police. And, afraid that they'll be shot because of the color of their skin.
So when you hear stories like the one about Mr. Floyd, what does that make you think?
Scared.
Yeah. George Floyd was buried next to his mother in the place he once called home.
Your family's going to miss you, George, but your nation is going to always remember your name.
He left behind children, a family, and a movement they hope will end the pattern of unarmed African Americans dying at the hands of police. John Hendren, Al Jazeera, Houston.
In the U.S., where the protests began, policymakers are beginning to respond to protesters' demands. U.S. Democratic leaders have proposed a bill demanding sweeping police reforms. In the UK, a statue of an 18th century slave trader has been removed from outside a museum in London. And the UN has reversed a ban on staff taking part in anti-racism protests days after it instructed employees not to. In France, chokeholds used by arresting officers are now forbidden. And Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte has confessed he's had to reconsider a local tradition of using so-called blackface makeup at Christmas. All right, let's bring in our guests. From Columbus, Ohio, Treva Lindsey, Associate Professor of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at The Ohio State University. From Johannesburg, Thembisa Fakude, researcher at the Al Jazeera Center for Studies, and from Pisa, Italy, Udo Enwereuzor, head of race and ethnicity equality for COSPE, Cooperation for the Development of Emerging Countries. A warm welcome to you all. Treva, let me start with you. You wrote a piece last week that says the push to acknowledge and rally around Black women and girls victimized by police violence remains an uphill battle. The piece also says the comparative lack of mobilized outrage for the killing of Black women and girls is an injurious erasure. Why is it such an uphill battle? Why did the killing, for example, of Breonna Taylor, a health worker who was shot 8 times by police who entered her apartment in Louisville, Kentucky in March, why has that only become more widespread in the past few weeks?
Yes, thank you for that question, and thank you for having me today. I think one of the major issues we have to contend with is the way that we frame police killings, particularly in the United States context, as something that is uniquely and disproportionately affecting Black men and boys in our nation. And while Black men and boys are the most likely to be gunned down, proportionately speaking, by police violence, Black women and girls are also 1.4 times more likely than white women to be killed by police, and often in our homes. So one of the main reasons, I think, is that when we see a number of the deaths of Black women at the hands of police officers, they're in the domestic space, they're in the home space, like a Breonna Taylor. So there is no Darnella Frazier, who was the 17-year-old Black girl who filmed the murder of George Floyd, to really back up and give us a sense of what that kind of violence looks like. We saw that with 7-year-old Aiyana Stanley Jones in 2010 in Detroit, another raid that went wrong in which the 7-year-old girl was killed in her own home. Or Black women who are in mental distress and the police are called on them and end up killed, like Pearlie Golden or Deborah Danner. And so there is this large history of Black women facing both fatal violence and also sexual violence at the hands of police that has yet to cause the kind of uproar that we're looking for. Breonna Taylor, in the Taylor case, the 3 officers who were responsible for the raid still have not been arrested. And so there is mobilization in these local contexts and a growing swell. But that is why we demand that Say Her Name, that hashtag that came into existence in 2015, to begin to reckon with our erasure of Black women and girls and to reckon with the sexism that often impacts how we mobilize around these deaths and who we organize around and the pushes that we make to address this kind of violence.
Thembisa, from your vantage point, what does it say to you that protests are not just happening in the U.S., that they have spanned continents?
Well, it's been quite interesting to see the growing international solidarity against racism. And we've been through this in South Africa over the years. We also relied upon the international community to push back the negativities that were going on in this country. So this, for me, is some sort of a resumption of that solidarity movement that we saw during the days when most Black South Africans and white South Africans were fighting against the dismantling of an apartheid government. So this has triggered something which is, I guess, after the apartheid collapse in 1994, something that has been very necessary. We've seen the emergence of ultra nationalism, racism, xenophobia around the world, particularly after the 2 main events, which was the election of Donald Trump and Brexit. These people have somehow been emboldened to go out and create this new normal where racism, xenophobia, and sexism was becoming a norm. So it's quite an interesting times, and I think in South Africa we've seen the the stubbornness of apartheid norms, refusing to go away from our society. So this, what has happened in the United States, it has kind of resuscitated the movement. Even here in South Africa, we had protests as well, and this is probably most likely to continue even post the COVID lockdown that we're currently in at the moment.
Udo, there have been protests in Italy, in Spain, Belgium, Denmark, Hungary. Were you surprised to see protests in so many different parts of Europe? And what does this say about how widespread racism is in European countries?
Well, indeed, there have been protests across Europe, across cities across Europe, and I must say I found all this very encouraging because in recent years, many of those of us in the anti-racist movement we've kind of felt sometimes isolated. Though the type of racist violence we face here is somewhat different from the case of the U.S. In the sense that while we do have serious cases of uh, uh, um, profiling, racial profiling by the police across at least EU member states. I can't talk about these states and not the other ones not much. While we do have a lot serious problems of racial profiling, we don't have cases of people murdered by police, though there are incidents, people dying on very unclear circumstances. But then popular support against, at times, very serious cases of racist violence leading to death has not been that much in recent years. So what is happening in the U.S. has sparked a support back here. The effect here is absolutely encouraging, and partly also because it's brought in many young people, including young people of African descent, who yes, so much on them. Of course, they do have their own. This generation, they have their own way of protesting, of taking care of issues on social media and so on. But they've not been that much marching in the streets as previous generations, including mine, we were forced to do at the time. So what has happened this last week, to be honest, has been encouraging, and it is a challenge. We in the civil society organization will have to pick up from here, build on it, to make sure the momentum is not lost. An opportunity for change we'll have to really struggle hard to take advantage of.
Treva, there are growing calls in the U.S. now to defund the police. From your point of view, would that actually help address systemic racism? And if not, what steps need to be taken in order to do that?
Absolutely. It's a great question. I think when we hear defund the police, we don't bucket all in the US when we defund public schools, when we defund healthcare systems, when we defund social services. We see that happen all the time. They're called cuts that happen in these industries. And I think what's important in this moment for defunding the police is a means for those of us within an abolitionist tradition who are working to abolish the police, which is one of the calls that we've seen happening in recent years, but has really been spearheaded over the last few decades by people like Angela Davis, Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, Miriam Kaba, this tradition of thinking about what is a world without policing, what is a world without prisons. And so defunding the police means taking those resources that localities, districts give to policing for surveillance and other means of controlling the population, not protecting and serving, and reinvesting that money into programs like educational programs, like social services, like aiding the things that really do impact public safety. Having affordable housing matters for public safety. Having a public health approach to drug addiction as opposed to a criminalizing approach really helps in that space. And so I think when we're seeing these calls for defunding the police and more of a groundswell around that, more of a robust debate around what that means is, what are we willing to invest in? And saying that we're willing to invest in a system that is deeply tied to systemic racism in this nation, policing at its origins, that are derived from slave patrols, from squishing labor, from protecting property, particularly white men's property in the context of the US, and looking forward in that history. These are the afterlives, as Saidiya Hartman would say, of a racist system. So it's not that the system is broken. It's working exactly the way it was designed to do, which is to exploit, to harm, to surveil, and to police those on the margins. And in our nation, that is Black people, that is Indigenous people, brown people, people with disabilities, and people without capital. And so the defunding of police gets us to redirect that money and eventually work for a public safety that is community-based, that is community-centered, and that focuses on the needs of the community, which in fact would help us reduce crime. We've seen models like that, Camden, New Jersey being one of them, where we saw a defunding and disbanding of the police department to a different model, and you saw a drop in violent crime. And so this is not something that is untested and unproven, but I think it empowers us to have a new imagination, that we have to imagine a world without policing. And this movement feels like an opportunity to do that radical reimagination.
Thembisa, I want to try and expand on some of what you were saying in your previous answer. I want to ask you more specifically, for Black South Africans, is what happened to George Floyd, does that seem like an extension of their own collective experience with police brutality?
Well, yes, it is. I mean, during apartheid, we had similar incidences happening mainly within the black society. But I want to touch on your previous question. I do support the taking away of the budget, defunding of police. In fact, I'll go further to say we need to even defund some of the defense departments within certain countries and take that money, use it to fight racism. I think what has happened, particularly in South Africa, there's been a situation where people started feeling too comfortable and forgetting that the fight against racism is a permanent occupation. And I'm one of those who believe that we should have a permanent department or ministry within our government that will continually deal with issues of sexism, discrimination, and racism, because it's not a part-time responsibility, it's something that's supposed to go on and continue, because racism rears its head at a certain moment, and it's not only police who perpetuate these kind of things or will trigger situations where people will protest, but there are a lot of instances where there's subtle racism going on in different places within our society. So we have had this kind of situation in South Africa, and unfortunately those days, suggestions like defunding police or military apparatuses in South Africa was not a discussion. But I'll argue that even now, notwithstanding the political situation we find ourselves in, it is a call worth debating, not only in the United States, but around the world, of defunding and taking some of the money from the police and defense ministries and put it elsewhere where it can fight anti-racism.
Udo, how much of these protests are also essentially against right-wing and populist politics, which have emerged in many European countries in the wake of the Brexit referendum and the election of U.S. President Donald Trump?
Well, very much so, I must say, because racism is driven to a great extent, at least in the last decade in Europe, in the European Union in particular. Racism is clearly driven by right-wing groups and right-wing political groups, including political parties, including prominent members in these parties. So the movement also is a reaction, a challenge to the extremist political views that have been around, that have led to very serious cases. Back in Italy, where I am, in 2008, we recorded a range of violent racist attacks that led to deaths, people being shot in the street, something we rarely have. And many of this was fueled by violent extremist discourse, inciting to hate against migrants, refugees. The discourse on the so-called migration crisis began in Europe, in the EU, in Europe in particular, beginning from 2013 and 14, often has this, the backing is pushed forward by this group. So the reaction we've had, the protest we've seen in Europe, is also a reaction to such political extremist expressions and criminalizing of minorities.
Treva, there are a lot of polls that have been conducted in the U.S. right now that are showing that a majority of Americans are viewing the killing of George Floyd as indicative of a broader problem with law enforcement in the U.S., instead of it just being seen as an isolated episode. How much pressure is this going to put on lawmakers in the U.S. to take steps to reforming these policing policies?
I think it's going to be a considerable amount of pressure. We're also in an election year in the US. And of course, this is all happening amidst a global pandemic, which has set a certain magnifying glass to problems that are already existing, that we're looking at unemployment, we're looking at different healthcare outcomes, et cetera. So seeing systemic racism in a number of different ways has played out in the last few months. And I think this was just the kind of final straw for really getting lawmakers to see we have to be explicit about our commitments to addressing systemic racism, to addressing policing. So already you have the Democrats in Congress proposing a justice in policing. Presidential candidate Joe Biden just came up with a kind of $300 million push for police reform. And I think what we're seeing in response to that is people like, this feels like a different moment in terms of rallying around reform, that there are people more invested in reform. In fact, you have more people in this moment interested as well in something other than reform, that pushing beyond reform too. But I think what that gets us is to a moment where the U.S. is finally attempting to reckon with this long and inglorious history of racist policing, of biased policing, and that lawmakers are going to have to make statements, are going to have to be putting their names on bills, talking in communities, talking with organizers who are on the front lines about what in fact is a progressive resolution to this long-standing problem. And although reform is some of the language that we're going to see most lawmakers make, I'm very curious to see how many lawmakers really come out on the side of saying we need a radical reinvention of this, like we saw with the city council in Minneapolis responding to this and saying, you know, we have a veto-proof majority that's invested in cutting ties with the Minneapolis Police Department and reimagining something else. We see LA defunding to the extent of $100 and $150 million from the Los Angeles PD. And I think we're going to see this across locales in the nation to say, what are we truly committed to? And are we going to do the long, hard, uncomfortable work of addressing systemic racism in policing and the criminal justice system more broadly?
Thembisa, there is a conversation that is going on all over the world right now in which people are trying to figure out how to overcome racism. From your perspective, can racism actually be overcome? And if so, how?
Well, I think the concentration on legislation with the goal that legislation could eradicate racism, I don't think that alone could do the work. I think we should have or encourage some partnerships between the civil society, government, and business in continually coming up with campaigns that will fight racism. Legislation alone won't help or won't actually help eradicate racism. We've seen in South Africa, which has been for years a bastion of racism, that it didn't work. You have government that has been very active in trying to come up with laws and, you know, at times persecuting people who are accused of racism. But that alone will not work. I'm of the view that the only way we can deal with this challenge of racism is if we have partnerships between civil society, government, and business, continual engagement and organizing of campaigns that will create awareness, particularly within the youth, create awareness within the minorities and majority communities in countries, for example, like America. You have certain parts of the United States where people are not even aware that they're being racist because there are a lot of subtleties within racism. So I'm of the view that campaigns which can be organized by both business, civil society, and government can do the trick.
All right, well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much to all our guests, Treva Lindsey, Thembisa Fakude, and Udo Enwereuzor. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.